in the building.
Antique music. Not born again. Easy.
Man-made. These divisions, they are man-made. We have vice. We have vice, but we cannot see. We got to find a new way to be. This is a worldwide black family. No matter where you're from, Africa is still your home. Cuban or Dominican or Panamanian. No matter where you're from, Africa is still your home. Jamaican or American, Haitian or Brazilian. One Africa.
To the world, where we bring God.
All around the
Together we stand, divide and we follow.
One Africa.
You just celebrate,
All around the world. Get free. The time has come for us to get free. It's time we break the chains of slavery. We got to find a new way to be. This is a worldwide black family. No matter where you're from, Africa is still your home. Mexican, Colombian, or Boricano. No matter where you're from, Africa is still your home. Belizean or Peruvian, or Honduran. One Africa.
to the world, where we bring God.
All around the
Together we stand, divide and we follow.
One Africa.
You just celebrate,
All around the world. They don't wanna see us unite. All they want us to do is keep on fussing and fighting. They don't wanna see us live together. All they want us to do is keep on killing one another all around the world. One Africa. 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 We got to find a new way to be. This is a worldwide black
What me say?
family.
Proud to be black, I'm an African. From higher heights, me militant. West Africa, me from an Vatican. We were born with the light, we under the sun. Repatriation is a must if you liberate yourself. We tired of the war and fight. Cause there is nothing you can do. Know yourself, you know your history. Work out for uplift to new life. Freedom we need. God, I'm mother of civilization. Peace to the world. One love, my religion. Together we are gonna build up the nation. No matter where you come from, we are one blood. Accept one another whenever you touch road. Listen me, see links to the globe. All for one for all, so the thing go.
We got to find a new way to be. This is a worldwide black family.
Greetings, everybody. My name is Onyesanu. I'm here with my comrade David. Hey, David.
Hey everybody.
And this is the monthly Pan-African film series. We are APRP New Mexico, All African Peoples Revolutionary Party New Mexico. And we do this film series on the second Saturday of each month at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. This is our December edition, and we're very happy to be here with y'all today. The film, oh, there you are, hello. So the film that we're showing today, David, do you want to talk about it, or should I?
This is a film that of a presentation that was put together by NLG International, that's the National Lawyers Guild, of a presentation by Professor Horace Campbell, who's an internationally known peace and justice activist, presenting on Africom, U.S. Africom, I should say, African Command, which is being used as a military apparatus to control African resources. But we'll get into the video here shortly and have a discussion following thereafter. And if there's anything you'd like to add on the floor.
Nope, that was great. So yep, as David said, we're going to show this lecture by Dr. Horace Campbell. We're going to discuss it afterwards, so stick around. The lecture is about 90 minutes long. As always, if you have issues hearing or seeing the movie, just let us know in the chat and we will take care of it. And now, without further ado, I will start the film and we'll see you in 90 minutes.
Goal is to provide military programs that enhance security and stability on the continent.
Africom is the creation of the Bush administration, Donald Rumsfeld to be exact, to expand the power, the outreach, the resources of the Department of Defense at a time really when the continent needs development, needs housing, needs healthcare, needs education, those core building blocks of healthy societies. The U.S. responds really with arms, with military training, with equipment and other military hardware. This, however, is not necessarily new.
Dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu.
So what we see now is a repeat of that Cold War experience, really, with the U.S. arming and equipping militaries, essentially putting forward a military fist, but covering it up with the velvet glove of humanitarianism and development.
We deliver this humanitarian assistance to these people. It helps increase that feeling of will and, importantly, providing a benefit to the population.
If there ever was a situation where Africom personnel had to choose between protecting American interests or providing peace and stability to the African people, and we know that this choice will come up a lot. What are they going to choose?
First, it's controlling oil. Africa has now, as of December 2007, surpassed the Middle East as a source for U.S. oil. And we know, just as the case with Iraq, where there's oil, there's military might. The second is containing China. We know the U.S. right now sees this burgeoning power happening, and the U.S. in their quest for empire wants to make sure that they contain China. And the third issue is the so-called war on terrorism.
The United States retaliates for the bombing of its embassies. Cruise missiles are launched against suspected militant bases in Sudan and Afghanistan.
The government has denounced the attacks on what it has said was a civilian pharmaceuticals factory.
And breaking news this hour, one of the FBI's most wanted terrorists targeted in a U.S. airstrike in Somalia.
News agency reports are already saying that civilians on the ground died in this U.S. military strike.
Africa Command is here and helping our partner nations to be more capable in providing for your own security.
My security as a citizen in Africa does not rest on a program that is developed in Washington or or The Hague or London. It actually rests on, first and foremost, my government's capacity to be able to meet my basic fundamental needs.
One foot on each side, one foot on the African side, understanding the impact of militarism on women and children on the African continent, as someone who's here in the U.S. and seeing the impact of militarism on particularly Black and brown communities here in the U.S., I think it is critical for us to begin to raise our voices to say that we demand in the 21st century a different way, a way that does not see people as invisible, a way that puts people and human needs first.
Check, 1, 2. Dropping truth bombs, saying no to Africom. Sons, setting the example. Come on. When we say invest in Africa, people sit back and laugh at you. All they hear about is them genocides and massacres. Listen to the isms and schisms they see on television. So they say the only solution is foreign intervention. Militarism, see the vision, building more prisons and mass detention for the citizens who start resisting. We need in healthcare, infrastructure, education. We sick of warfare, coup d'etats and starvation. Puppet regimes, imperialistic schemes. Invest in bullets and bombs instead of in human beings. I spit it like Martin King and tell you I have a dream that Africa's finally free of violence and poverty. Woo!
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I hope the week is off to a good start for all of you. My name is Carrie McLean, and I am the chair of the NLG's Africa Subcommittee. Welcome to the webinar, Africom and US Militarism in Africa. I'm so pleased that Professor Horace G. Campbell is here to share his knowledge on this topic. Professor Campbell has been writing about and speaking about Africom for over a decade. Professor Campbell is an internationally known peace and justice activist. He holds a joint professorship in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Political Science at Syracuse University. He's taught in Asia, Europe, and Africa. For example, he taught at the University of Dar es Salaam from 1981 to 1987, and more recently was a distinguished Kwame Nkrumah Chair at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Professor Campbell's most recent book is Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, Lessons for Africa in the Forging of African Unity. His most well-known book, Rasta and Resistance from Marcus Garvey to Walter Rodney, is going through its 8th printing and has been translated into 4 languages. He's also the author of Reclaiming Zimbabwe, The Exhaustion of the Patriarchal Model of Liberation. Professor Campbell is completing a book on US militarism and African independence. He's authored over 100 journal articles and a dozen monographs, including a recent publication entitled The Quagmire of US Militarism in Africa. Without further ado, I present Professor Horace Campbell.
Okay, good afternoon, Kerry, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I can see that there are many friends and colleagues and comrades who have joined this webinar. And I want to say that the National Lawyers Guild is an organization that I have some familiarity with because my comrade, Joan Gibbs, who has been working in the vineyards for many decades, as someone who has worked tirelessly for human rights, against mass incarceration, against the prison industrial complex, and working for Palestinian solidarity. And Joan Gibbs, I think, was the one who was the force behind bringing us together for that last conference that we held. Today, that conference was held when there was still anxiety in the country about the outcome of the uprisings in 2020 and the future of white supremacy. Some of that has now been abated at the end of the electoral process. And so when I was asked by the National Lawyers Guild to participate in this discussion, I thought it'd be an opportunity to raise some questions about the future of the United States military in general, and in particular on the US military command. So I would like you to bear with me to place the question of the United States Africa Command in the larger context of the United States militarism and the military management of the international system. The basic thesis of this presentation is that the anti-racist forces internationally must be in the forefront of pushing for the demilitarization of the planet Earth and ending the military management of the international system. And I will probably explain how the military management of the international system forces the militarization of US foreign policy. So specifically, the African descendants in the United States and those who suffer from racial capitalism must focus on demilitarization. And in this sense, the demilitarization involves the dismantling of the US Africa Command. Throughout the year 2020, the pandemic, the pandemic of racism, systemic racism, the pandemic of capitalism, police violence. These questions brought massive mobilization of people to oppose the militarization of the US society. And the challenge for the peace movement, having mobilized politically in the streets and electorally to defeat the Trump administration, is to say whether the coming into government on January 20th, 2021, will this bring about significant changes in the military management of the international system? And will this bring about changes in the US Africa Command? Now, these questions have been sharpened by the fact that a week after the election results, the Pentagon announced that there was be consolidation of the US Army Europe and the US Army Africa. This consolidation of the US Army Europe and the US Army Africa was one outcome of the activism of people in Africa who have been calling for the dismantling of the US Africa Command. In fact, throughout its 12-year history from 2008 to the present, the US Africa Command was never able to gain legitimacy in Africa. And the opposition from the entire African continent, especially the youth and progressive forces, that reflected itself in some governments calling for the Africom not to be placed anywhere on the continent. This meant that the US Africa Command was always on the defensive when it came to Africa. So this announcement of consolidating the US Army Europe and the US Army Africa is going against the very thing that Donald Rumsfeld said when they launched Africom in 2006, 2007, that they wanted to end the African domination through the United States European Command. And I will spend a little bit of time talking about the US military management and the command structure, the European Command, the Pacific Command, the Central Command. Africa was under the Central Command at that time, and Rumsfeld established the Africa Command. What we will do, though, in this presentation is to demonstrate how the Africa Command was part of the information operations of the United States military. And by information operations, I mean the vast propaganda machine that was established by the government that integrated the military, the financial institutions, the political institutions, the think tanks and academia to hype the idea of war. And then in the case of the war on terror, Africa and Africans were labeled terrorists. But this psychological warfare really was one component of the reproduction of white supremacy and systemic racism. And so this psychological warfare never had any great roots in Africa. So the this consolidation of the US Army Europe and US Army Africa will bring us to highlight the changing justifications for the US Africa Command. At all times, they were talking about fighting terrorism, stopping China from encroaching in Africa, And then another time they were talking about development, diplomacy, and democracy and defense. So the point is, the military planners never had a coherent justification for launching a US Africa Command, other than to militarize Africa and to draw African dictators and African militarists closer into the web of US militarism globally. So what we have seen in the past 12 years is that the history of US racism and militarism has led to the destruction of African lives. We've seen that in the past, but what the Pentagon calls the watershed moment for the US Africa Command was the destruction of the Libyan society. And now when the US military writes about Africom, they no longer write about Libya as part of their success. Although 9 years ago in October, when they killed Gaddafi, they were calling that the US was most successful operation was in Libya. The current role of the United States military in Niger, supporting French militarism and the European control of West Africa, is the current manifestation of Africa. So the consolidation of the US Army in Africa and the US Army Europe is to return the US military and the US government to the alliance with white racists in Western Europe. So this is going against what the Africans have been calling for silencing guns in 2020 and the role of the African Union. In the conclusion, we will link the question of demilitarization in Africa to the question of reparative justice. How do we repair the crimes of white supremacy? How do we repair the planet Earth? How do we repair the history of white supremacy and systemic racism? How do we repair the destruction of capitalism? These questions are very much urgent, and I am optimistic that the National Lawyers Guild and the progressive forces who have been in the forefront of opposing Africom will intensify their work in drawing new constituencies into the intellectual, information, and academic work, which must be unleashed to mobilize the society against the US Africa Command. So this is what I'm hoping to do in the next 20 or so minutes. So let me start by focusing on this new announcement, because this new announcement is actually a victory in some sense, because the US Africa Command is winding up its old operation in Stuttgart, Germany, because when the US Africa Command was announced, they were looking for a base in Africa, but they could not find a base in Africa because of the opposition of African leaders, especially the South African leadership at that time, Terry Lakota and Thabo Mbeki. And so the US Africa Command based itself in Stuttgart, Germany. Though last week it was announced that the US Africa Command will merge the Europe and Africa Commands under a single 4-star headquarters, and it's going to be based in Italy or southern Spain. So why did the Pentagon make this move? And what is the importance of this move for the future of the US Africa Command? I think this is where we want to begin, because we want to begin with the expanded militarization of the society since the deepening of the capitalist crisis at the turn of the 21st century. At the turn of the 21st century, the deepening capitalist crisis, which we saw in 2007, 2008, and we saw that in the financial crisis at the end of the 20th century, the United States embarked on a major militarization of the planet. And the architects of this militarization came from the most conservative and racist section of the United States population. The military operations were unleashed on what Donald Rumsfeld called the information operations. That is the use of information, propaganda, and psychological warfare against the United States population. Now, the writings by journalists from the New York Times then talked about how this psychological warfare and propaganda was aimed against the citizens of the United States of America. And one of the quotations from David Barstow of the New York Times was that the people should not be prepared just for a long war against Afghanistan and Iraq, but for a long war, that is, for the United States to be involved in unending wars. And recently, there's a scholar from the Brookings Institute who has written about this propaganda, and he labeled the propaganda misinformation from Donald Trump, and how Donald Trump is actually basing his entire leadership on lies. But to locate the disinformation, propaganda, and lies at the feet of the Republican Party under Donald Trump is to miss the continuities in the militarization of the planet Earth by the US government that goes from the United States went off the dollar in 1971. And this militarization has been bipartisan. And in the past 12 to 14 years, the United States has spent over $6 trillion on these unending wars. So Anthony Postman from the Center for Strategic and International Studies has come out with studies that these expenditure of trillions of dollars have only created more insecurity in the world. And so these studies of the US military on the US Army in Iraq, Volume 1, Invasion, Insurgency, and Civil War, and Volume 2, Surge and Withdrawal. This study by the military itself talked about the failures of the United States military in Iraq. What is needed from the activists, from those who are allied to the National Lawyers Guild and progressive academics, peace activists, and I see my comrade from the Black Alliance for Peace is also in this webinar. And they've been doing a lot of work on this question of Africom and dismantling Africom. What is needed is that the same kind of investment in exposing the wars in Afghanistan and the trillions of dollars, the same kind of investment is needed so that we can see how the evolution of the United States Africa Command has brought about the same kind of destruction in Africa. So the writings on the United States Africa Command can be divided into more or less 3 or 4 different groups. And I would, my writings, along with progressive scholars from the African Studies group, they call the Concerned African Studies Scholars, and groups like the Black Alliance for Peace. That is one body of work that has been done on the US Africom and the US Africa Command. But most journalists, most churches, humanitarian organizations do not have access to that body of scholarship. The dominant reproduction of ideas on the US Africa Command comes out of the country itself, because one of the things that the US Africa Command did in its development was to set up what they call the United States Africa Command Social Science Council, so that most of the research done on Africa by universities had to be routed through the Pentagon. So any kind of search through libraries or through the internet would bring you back to the ideas that come from the Pentagon about Africa being a hotbed of terrorism and Africa being a base for instability. And in fact, some of the people who call themselves progressive go back to the same disinformation and psychological warfare of the Pentagon to reproduce ideas about Africa being a hotbed. One of the things which even some of my colleagues in the peace movement do is to reproduce these maps, which show that the US Africa Command have bases all over Africa. And I said to myself, do they understand how much they're reproducing the propaganda of the US military? Because when a writer writes about that the United States have military bases all over Africa, they never had more than 6,000 or 7,000 troops in Africa. So what those people on the left are actually trying to tell us is that 7,000 to 8,000 United States military personnel on the African continent can control 1 billion persons. And I want to appeal to my brothers and sisters in the peace movement and on the left not to reproduce that kind of literature and these maps that shows the United States Africa Command controlling Africa in the same way. And so we have a body of scholarship, and a lot of this writing come from those around the Intercept. And the Intercept, they depend on what they write from the communications department of the US Africa Command. So that's the second body of scholarship. I'm sorry, that's the third body of scholarship. And the fourth body of scholarship on the US Africa Command is from the think tanks like the Brookings Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the CSIS, Federation of American Scientists. So what I'm trying to say is that the literature and information that comes on the Africom is dominated by the Pentagon and mainstream forces. And so this work to try to unleash a new understanding of Africom is very important to break the sense that Africa is a hotbed of terror and terrorism. We may want to say from the outset that this psychological warfare and disinformation about Africa being the hotbed of terror and terrorism could never hold sway among Africans, because the racism of the United States system was such that all African freedom fighters were labeled as terrorists. Whether it's Felix Mume in the Cameroon, Samora Machel in Mozambique, Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, all African freedom fighters were labeled as terrorists. And therefore, the United States information and reproducing ideas about terrorism could never find root among African descendants, either in Africa or in the United States of America. I would like to remind those who are younger on this webinar that it was a leader such as Malcolm X who said very clearly in the early 1960, when there was a struggle over the Congo, that if you do not understand what's going on in the Congo, you cannot know what's going on in Mississippi. And Malcolm X, Maya Angelou, Amir Baraka stormed the United Nations at the time of the killing of Patrice Lumumba. And one of the outstanding questions for the United States military apparatus, academic apparatus, is the complicity of the United States government in the killing of Patrice Lumumba and the killing of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld. In fact, while Africans have forced the United Nations to unleash an investigation into the killing of Dag Hammarskjöld, the United States has still not complied with opening up their history of the complicity of the United States in the killing of Dag Hammarskjöld. So although the United States has embarked on this information operation and they've invested millions of dollars on studies on how to bring peace and humanitarianism to Africa, it could never get anywhere in Africa. However, after the defeat of the white supremacists in South Africa, the military defeat of the South Africans at Kutupana Valley was a turning point in the history of Africa. And then, even then, Chester Crocker and the United States wrote on the changes in Southern Africa that it was the United States that was bringing peace to Southern Africa. At the end of apartheid, the United States embarked on what they call the Africa Crisis Response Initiative. The Africa Crisis Response Initiative was the announcement of the Clinton administration that they were going to be more active militarily in Africa, and the legitimation at that point was to support humanitarianism. Now, I should add that in 1993, when the United States military was humiliated in Somalia, PDD 25 of the Clinton administration did not want the United States military to be engaged in Africa. But the competition between the Europeans and the United States over Africa led to the establishment of the Africa Crisis Response Initiative and the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. The Africa Growth and Opportunity Act were the twin, that was like a pincer movement to intensify the United States military operations in Africa. This did not get anywhere. And afterwards they changed to the quota. But what is important is that under George Bush, the definition of Africom as the lead agency to fighting the war on terror in Africa was one where the United States represented itself as supporting Africans in fighting HIV/AIDS. So George Bush got Congress to spend or to put $15 billion towards PEPFAR, Presidential Initiative to fight AIDS. But one of the things that research will bring out is that this money, most of this money did not go into Africa. So the United States said at that time that they were going to fight terrorism. And the challenge of the peace activists and opposition from Africans meant that the United States had to be continuously reformulating its position. So Africom was established in 2008. Between 2006 and 2008, the United States moved to integrate the responsibilities of three command structures. The European command structure, which covered the United States military presence in Europe. Central Command, which represented the United States military presence in the West Asia, so that the wars that have been fought since 2001 have been fought through Central Command, which is based in Tampa, and the Pacific Command. So the Africa as an area of responsibility had been divided between the three commands: the European Command, the Central Command, and the Pacific Command. The Pacific Command had the islands of Malagasy and the islands in the Indian Ocean. And the European Command had control over most of Africa, and the Central Command had East Africa along with Egypt. One of the important changes about the African Command is that the African Command not included Egypt because of the importance of Egypt in relation to the oppression of the Palestinian people and the alliance of the Egyptian leadership with Israel. So Egypt, up to this point, was never under the U.S. Africa Command. And one of the things I would like to appeal for all those on this webinar is that progressive Africans should never use the formulation sub-Saharan Africa. The formulation sub-Saharan Africa is in itself a racist formulation which comes out of the old formulations like tropical Africa, Black Africa, and the African Union is a union of the peoples of Africa, of all parts of Africa. So it really hurts me when I hear my brothers and sisters who are in the progressive movement talks about sub-Saharan Africa. There's no, the sub-Saharan Africa, that formulation is also part of the racism that separates African people north of the Sahara and separate them from African people south of the Sahara. So the creation of the U.S. Africa Command continues this confusion among the U.S. military planners and the State Department. So for the Pentagon, they deal with Africom, which is all 54 countries of Africa except Egypt. For the State Department, they have sub-Saharan Africa, and then they have North Africa and the Middle East. And then the different departments of the US government and the US university system that reproduce this racism about sub-Saharan Africa cannot decide whether Sudan is part of sub-Saharan Africa or Sudan is part of the rest of Africa. So at all times, the US Africa Command was premised on the idea of bringing peace to Africa. George Bush in February 2007, when they were discussing in the national security corridors of the United States, says that the new command will strengthen our security cooperation with Africa and create new opportunities to bolster the capabilities of our partners in Africa. Africa Command will enhance our efforts to bring peace and security to the people of Africa and promote our common goals of development, health, education, democracy, and economic growth in Africa. So this is the justification for Africa Command. Note the word partners in Africa. And what they mean by partners in Africa are those African governments that ally with the United States government that implement neoliberal policies in Africa to exploit the African peoples. And their leading partner in Africa is Sisi of Egypt, and Museveni of Uganda, Deby of Chad, the Ethiopian leadership, Kagame. These are the leaders that they talk about when they talk about the United States partners in Africa. So the justification then in 2007 for the Africa Command was to build partnership capacity, support the United States government agencies in implementing security policies. And when they mean security in Africa, they mean security of capital. Conduct theater security cooperation, increase partner counterterrorism skills, enhance humanitarian assistance, and foster respect for human rights and support Africa regional organizations. And the Africa regional organizations they do not support is the African Union, because they undermine the African Union and efforts of the African Union to bring peace. So at that point, in 2008, the Department of Defense, their reasons for going to Africa is to prevent disruptions in African oil production and export. I'm drawing this to your attention because by 2015, when the United States becomes the number one oil producer in the world, the question of African oil was no longer important in the legitimation of Africa Command. But this question of China and Chinese economic transformation has always been important to the United States. So the Department of Defense in 2007 said they want to meet the challenge of China in Africa. This has now come back to be one of the main justifications for Africom. Controlling ungoverned regions and transnational extremism, dealing with instability in the Horn of Africa, dealing with instability in the Great Lakes region, and dealing with instability in Sudan. So the US Africa Command established their legitimacy, and they had the areas of responsibility. I want to point out that before the US Africa Command, we had the United States European Command, which covers all of Europe. And then the US European Command covered all of Africa. And then we have the United States Central Command. The announcement last week brings back the United States back to the period of the United States European Command, where the United States will be aligning itself with European colonialists in Africa, especially governments like France. So the United States is not a major trading partner in Africa. In fact, if you look at the dominant trading partners in Africa, they would be the European Union, it would be China, and then India and the United States would be fourth on the list, and then fifth would be Brazil. And yet, during the Clinton administration, the United States legitimated its foray into Africa, that it was going to increase trade and development with Africa. If you look at what has happened in Africa since 2008, is that there's been a decrease in trade, because one of the main line of trade between the United States and Africa was oil. And Africa is no longer selling as much oil to the United States of America. But the important question for us in this era of COVID is the relationship between militarism and intellectual property rights. The question of intellectual property rights is important for Africa, especially in this period when we're talking about when Africa, South Africa, and India are talking to the World Trade Organization to waive the intellectual property rights so that vaccines can be made available to Africa. I'm showing a picture of General Kip Ward, who was the first head of the United States Africa Command. Now, General Kip Ward, as the military head of the U.S. Africa Command, was using his own position in the military to advance the United States military interests in Africa. But regardless of how high the generals go in the United States military, they themselves face racism. And in a presentation I did, I drew comparison between the experience of General Kip Ward in the military when he was removed from his position because it was said that he took his wife on a military aircraft and stopped in Bermuda on the way to Africa, and he had to repay the military for the $80,000 that he spent on that trip. And we compared that to General Petraeus and his experience and how General Petraeus has moved on to private equity. And that is why Helen Cooper in the New York Times has been writing about the United States military as being a center for white supremacists, so that 41% of the United States military is non-white, and that is black and brown, that only 4% of the top generals of the United States military are non-white. And the writings of Ellen Cooper all of this year in the New York Times has pointed out to the growth of white supremacy in the military. For those of us in the peace movement, that's not our question. Our question is the role of the United States military, whether black or white, in perpetuating destruction. So after the United States justified militarism on fighting the war on terror, after the debacle in Libya, Africom represented itself as a development agency. That is, the U.S. Africa Command was promoting the 3 Ds: defense, development, and diplomacy. So the interagency operations meant that while academics were pointing to U.S. bases and troops in Africa, the main thrust of the United States efforts was what was called interagency operations, where the United States, all agencies of the United States government, military, agriculture, health, education, reported to the United States military, so that the DoD language program, human terrain systems, Minerva Research Initiative were far more important in how they tried to influence African universities, African scholarship on the question of Africa. So the weaponization of everything meant that the weaponization of academia, weaponization of work, in line with the United States military operation in Africa. Now, the weaponization of the internet and cyber warfare is a new thrust of the United States, and I would urge those who are in academia to follow the attempt of full spectrum dominance and the control of internet waves in places in West Africa. So the United States military has failed in Africa, and we have now talked about failure. I won't go into great details. I've already referred to its failure in Iraq, Syria, Libya, but along with this failure has come the destruction of millions of lives. I want to repeat this point that I'm making, because when writers such as Nick Turse write about the preponderance of US military bases in Africa, they miss out the more nefarious aspect of the role of the universities, think tanks, and graduate students, all parts of the United States of America, involved in the Africom social science project in Africa. So what is the situation now? I'm going to wind down in this situation in Africom, because the military itself write about the intervention in Libya as a watershed moment of the US Africa Command. And that watershed moment is a moment which should be discussed in all parts of the United States of America about how the United States created destruction in Libya and what this destruction in Libya has meant for the peoples of North Africa and the proliferation of weapons that came from Libya into West Africa. But the same white nationalism, the same racism, the same ideas of white supremacy that pervades the US military in the United States of America is manifest in people like Eric Prince, who, as a founder of Blackwater, has found a home in the United Arab Emirates, and the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Israel are allies with the white supremacists and Nazis in perpetuating US militarism in Africa at the present moment. Let me now conclude by talking about the question of racial capitalism, and that the struggle against Africom is also part of the struggle against racial capitalism and white supremacy. There's been a lot of talk and writing about systemic racism in the United States of America. And in the talk about systemic racism in the United States of America, they've tried to downplay the question of slavery and the wealth that has been accumulated from Africa and plunder. But this entrenchment of systemic racism has meant that every institution in the United States of America is pervaded with white racism. And none other is where this is more profound than in the United States military itself. So that even the president of the United States of America called Africa a shithouse continent. Ronald Reagan called Africans monkeys. Henry Kissinger said that whites were there to stay in Southern Africa. It is that history of racism reproduced in the knowledge system of the United States that affects young people from the African community when they go to Africa. I want to draw your attention to the killing of Sergeant David T. Johnson, who was killed in Niger. Niger is one of those spaces where the United States is collaborating with France for the control of West Africa, and his body was left to rot. He was a mechanic in the Special Forces Group in the United States of America, in the US Africa Command in Niger. And when he was being buried in Florida, Trump called the mother of Sergeant David T. Johnson and insulted the mother and said, well, he should know what he was signing up for. And the same thing goes for Staff Sergeant Logan Melga, who was strangled to death in Mali by white racists. And the white racist, after killing Melga, went to a conference where the Pentagon organized to give his wife a medal, and the people who killed Melga wanted to find out from the wife what Melga had told her about their corruption in Mali, where the United States was supposed to be fighting terrorism. So the experience of racism in the military is well known. And so what we need to see is that this $1 trillion that is being spent on militarism is part of the reproduction of racism generally. As Du Bois said at the time of World War I, what do nations care about the cost of military if by spending a few hundred millions in steel and gunpowder, they can gain 1,000 millions in diamonds? How can love of humanity appeal as a motive to nations whose love of luxury is built on inhuman exploitation of human beings, and who, especially in recent years, have been brought to regard these human beings as inhuman. This is the challenge in the United States of America, the challenge that the United States system views Africans as less than human beings. Let me end on this point. Since Donald Trump changed the leadership of the Pentagon 2 weeks ago, Christopher Miller, who is the acting Secretary of Defense, undertook to negotiate the end of the US military in Somalia. I've recently written a very long article called War as a Business, Lessons from Somalia, where I pointed out where it was a business between Al-Shabaab, the leadership of Kenya, the leadership of Uganda. But the Pentagon itself was negotiating with Qatar to buy off some of the leaders who were in business in warfare in Somalia. That pointed to the peace movement, that what was always being said about the war against so-called Al-Shabaab was actually work that the United States military was complicit, along with the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, in perpetuating the destabilization of East Africa. So I want to draw your attention to this event to show that just as how we had in Europe the Good Friday Agreement that ended the war in Ireland, that it is possible with concerted diplomatic and political pressure for the United States to completely withdraw from Africa and for the dismantling of the United States Africa Command. But it will require much more coherence on the part of the left and the progressive forces, so they do not buy into the propaganda war that Africa is on hotbed of terrorism. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to say that the political leadership in the United States of America, from the Black Lives Matter movement, the intellectual leadership that arose out of the uprisings of this year has fundamentally changed the country. And this change has manifested itself in people coming out in this multiracial and multi-generational alliance to beat back the white racists and the police brutality. How to build on that is the task of the peace movement at the moment. And I'm happy that the National Lawyers Guild is embarking on a series of education projects to oppose United States militarism so that we can pressure Black representatives of Congress, church leaders, community groups, peace groups in the United States to end the United States support the United States Africa Command. I'm going to stop there, Eric. I think I went back beyond my 40 minutes.
No, that's fine. Once again, you have given us so much to think about. Thank you for that excellent and informative presentation. I know that there are lots of questions. I'll let other people ask questions first. So people can either put their question in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. You can unmute yourself. Okay, so Lisa Frith, please unmute yourself.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for that report that you gave. That was very comprehensive. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I am speaking for myself, but I also want to share some information, okay? Because I support what we in the working class of all nationalities internationally, but especially in the US, the job that we have to do to unite the working class, which is multinational, multicultural, international, with the struggle that's going on in Africa as well as all over the world. Because what the professor has expounded so very clearly in terms of the evidence that it is imperialism, which is headed by the US, okay, in conjunction with the other imperialist nations that are have created the conditions, all of what he described. The question is what to do about it, okay? And I want to say that what my experience and knowledge has taught me, okay, and this, I became aware of the WS.org site, which stands for the World Socialist Website. I think people should really check it out. It's from the Socialist Equality Party International, okay? And the fact is that the question is, how are we going to break, the back of imperialism? How are we going to build a life that is beyond what we have now, okay, all over the world, which, includes Africa, okay? As a matter of fact, because the fact is that we cannot, what I've learned, we cannot solve these problems that has been expounded so eloquently by pressuring the present structure of government. We have to build, the strength and the knowledge and the power of the working class. In, those that are in Africa, that's what has to go on. Those in the US, that's what has to go on. We cannot be sucked into this thing of this one nation. This is how we're going to solve it. We're not going to solve it this way. We're only going to solve it by multinational internationalism, and also a program and a party that is multinational and international. And that's the Socialist Equality Party. And I'm just suggesting, I'm just putting it out there for people to read and to check it out for themselves, okay? Because all of what was said was absolutely true, okay? The question is, what do we do about it? Pressuring, like I said, the present structure is not going to get it, okay? They're bought and sold. We saw them give away $6 trillion in America to Wall Street when the COVID hit, okay? Now they have not done anything, and they do the same thing everywhere, okay? And then we cannot solve the problem of racism unless we break the back of the system of capitalism internationally, in the US especially, because that's the heart of the most aggressive. We have to for it to be linked with the people of all nations. Okay, so I just wanted to put that out there because we cannot get sucked into this thing that it's just about one nation. The thing is that the suffering and the hurt and the poverty and all of this is horrible, all over the world, and especially in Africa. you know, where all of these things that has been described has gone on. But so that's all I wanted to say. So the WSWS.org site and the Socialist Equality Party, just check them out, okay? And thank you for letting me talk.
All right, thanks very much. The next question or comment is from—
I would like to say something to what Lisa said.
Sure.
I belong to a global movement for peace. And this global movement for peace is international, and it supports a new social system, and it supports what I said in the introduction, repair of the planet Earth and repair of human beings and fighting for our humanity. But Lisa, I think the proposals you made in relationship to the WSWS is something that the left has to be very critical of, because in the Socialist Equality Party, there is a minimization of the impact of white racism on United States society and international capitalism. One of the most important developments in the intellectual culture of the United States has been the leadership of people like Cedric Robinson and Robin Kelly and Barbara Ransby in clarifying the nature of racial capitalism. In other words, one cannot go forward in this country without dealing with the impact of systemic racism and the ideas of white supremacy and how this pervades sections of the left. And what has amazed me is the campaign that has been launched by the Socialist Equality Party against the 1619 Project. Here is a project which came out of the intellectual culture of Africans in the United States of America, explaining the role of capitalism in the super exploitation of African people and the genocide of the First Nation peoples. And the 1619 Project, which is a basis for changing the educational system in this country, and the Socialist Equality Party has spent a lot of ink on what they call identity politics. I think that I would differ with those on the left that calls anti-racist struggle identity politics. It's actually people who are very comfortable in the skin of white supremacy to call the ideas of fighting white racism identity politics. So I would say, Lisa, that if we want to move forward in terms of an alliance of the working peoples, that we have to be able to educate all sections of the working people about the meaning of systemic racism.
Okay, and I respect what
Lisa,
you've just said.
Lisa, I'm sorry, we have to move on.
Okay. I just want to say one thing about the 1619 Project. It was proved to be ahistorical, and they had to withdraw all of the premise for that. And that was why, because it created division within the working class over the question of racism, because the fact is that it was ahistorical. And that's all. And if people go to that site and read for themselves and get, find the information, then they can also discuss it in depth more. Okay. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the next person, Tunde, I know that you had a comment or question.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. I just wanted to thank Dr. Campbell for that great presentation. It was super informative, and I thought it just brought in a lot of historical context and important pieces of information that some of which I wasn't aware of. So appreciate that. Thanks to you and you, Carrie, and the National Lawyers Guild for bringing this together. I also wanted to highlight that, as was mentioned in the presentation, the Black Alliance for Peace is, working on this Africom issue. We're trying to bring, a different perspective than the Pentagon narrative, essentially. And to that end, we have a campaign, US out of Africa, Shutdown Africom, which folks can check out on the blacklinesforpeace.com website. So I encourage folks to go there and check out the campaign demands. That's a big piece of this, and we're working to advance those demands and work with organizations on the continent. So I just wanted to call that out. But yeah, thanks again for putting this together.
Thank you, Tunde. Next is Marty Schmidt.
Oh, thank you very much, Carrie. And thank you very much, Dr. Campbell, for your wonderful talk. And I just had kind of a little question, but I'm really curious about your take on the ideological role of foundations and charitable organizations such as the Gates Foundation. I happen to live in the Seattle area, so preoccupied with how that works to, I think, promote militarism, but I'm interested in hearing what you think about that.
Thank you so much, Martha. The Gates Foundation has been complicit with the military in undermining African agency. It's in two areas that are very important in Africa, in health and education. The Gates Foundation is involved in something called AGRA, which is the Agricultural Revolution in Africa, which is to work with Monsanto and the biotech companies to change the ownership of seeds and the information about seeds in Africa. The Gates Foundation has also been very, very important in working with the United States World Bank philosophy in undermining the healthcare systems of Africa through PEPFAR. And so one of the things that Gates has done successfully is to isolate the discussion about the need for public health and healthcare in the United States of America. What I want to add, Martha, is at the end of apartheid, the foundations in the United States of America, that is people like the Soros Open Society Foundations, went on a project to promote what they call governance, democracy, and human rights in Africa. And governance for them was to persuade Africans that they should buy into neoliberalism and the World Bank prescriptions for Africa. So one of the things the left has not focused on enough is the work of these foundations in undermining African institutions and to tie up young Africans into this governance and democracy and human rights. Governance and democracy means supporting the IMF and World Bank, which means supporting militarism in Africa. So I wanted to thank you for that comment. And I think we need to be much more critical of the think tanks in the United States and the universities, because the think tanks, the universities, the Pentagon are all aligned in this information warfare against Africans.
Okay, thank you. The next question was in the chat from J. Pierre. I don't know if you want to speak, but he asked, can you speak more on Obama's role in expansion of Africom?
Yes, Obama's role in expansion of Africa. Okay, thank you. This is what I referred to in the recalibration of Africom, where Africom was moving from what Bush called the global war on terror to what Obama called the overseas contingency operations. and there was a continuity, but with the change of name. Now, Obama wanted to be very skillful by talking about the responsibilities of Africa. But Obama was never courageous enough to speak to the role of the Pentagon in Africa. And so at the time of the Libyan destruction, Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton and the representative to the United Nations who was in the White House at that time persuaded Obama to go along with the destruction of Libya. Now, in 2015, in an interview with Goldberg in The Atlantic, Obama said that this was the worst mistake of his presidency. And I think that nobody has asked Obama how it is that he came to make that mistake when it was clear from the email communication between Sarkozy and Hillary Clinton that this was a plot by France and in the United States, France and Britain, to take over Libya to ensure that Libya did not use its resources. Yes. So thank you, Michael. So Samantha Power was the third trio to persuade Obama. So what we need to do is to see how the holdover from the Obama administration, who are now coming into the Biden administration, carry the same humanitarian imperialism from the Obama period. The other point about Obama is in 2012, Obama went out to the West Point and to say that the war on terror must come to an end. And he thought that his own persuasion as a leader was enough to talk about the war on terror without laying bare the structures of the Pentagon that brought about this information warfare. And what Phyllis Bennis and Coburn has done in their book on ISIS was to show how the military infrastructure here responded to Obama with ISIS, and that the work on how ISIS came about in the Obama period is still has to be written. So the lack of the Obama's buying into private equity and retreating from any discussion of white racism was the logic of being the leader of the imperialist country in the world. So the Obama is as culpable as Bush in the destruction in Africa. Is that Obama tried to use the sophistication of being being pro-Black to cover up this. And we're going to get the same thing with people like Kamala Harris.
Okay, thank you. Jill Humphreys, I know you have a question. Jill? Okay, maybe she's gone.
Hi, Carrie.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I had to unmute. Sorry. Hello, Carrie. Hi, Professor Campbell. It's been a very long time.
Jill, are you back from Africa?
Yes, I am
Where
back
are you
from
now?
I'm in LA.
Oh,
But
okay.
I'm heading
okay.
to Ethiopia. I'm heading back to Ethiopia
You're
over the
getting back to
holidays.
Ethiopia.
Yes, and my question is related to your observation. You know, I've been following the conflict in Ethiopia, although I recognize it's regional. There's a regional context in which it's operating in, and I would like to understand a little bit more about why Prime Minister Abiy, I'm not going to use the term rebuffed, but I will say did not accept the African Union's attempt for mediation when the three African Union leaders went over, given what you said about how the US, right, undermines the AU, but here is an attempt by the AU to try to do an attempt at mediation. Could you talk a little bit more in detail or perhaps context as to why he would have done that and what that means in terms of the AU's efficacy?
Thank you very much, and good to see you again. I did an interview with KPFA in San Francisco and Berkeley last week on this war in the Ethiopia, and I want to state on this webinar that I support the African Union's position that there should be complete ceasefire and end to that war, and I support the efforts of the African Union. But I must say that the United States government and military has coddled the military leadership in Ethiopia. And by the military leadership, I mean both the current leaders in Addis Ababa and the leaders of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. In fact, when Meles was the president of Ethiopia, all of the main leaders in the United States, Susan Rice, Dale Smith, and all of the leadership in the United States coddled the Ethiopian leadership. And I think what I'm saying about demilitarization of the United States is also applicable to Ethiopia. One needs to see the complete demilitarization of Ethiopian society, because Ethiopian society has been held together by militarists, and the United States of America aligned itself with the militarists in the leadership of Ethiopia to create the situation that we have in Somalia and Al-Shabaab. And I don't know if you know the history of Jendai Fraser and Meles Zenawi in unleashing the terror and the problem that we have in Somalia today. So the problems of Oromia, problems of Tigray, the problems of the Somali in Ethiopia are all outstanding problems from the way in which Ethiopia is integrated in the global capitalist system. So the demilitarization of Ethiopia and the demilitarization of politics are aspects of the situation that the peace movement should be linked to in Ethiopia.
All right, thank you. Next, Larry Redmond, you can just ask the professor your question.
My question actually is, and maybe this harks back to what you were saying about Malcolm X. There's a militarization happening in the United States of America today that in my own view is designed to control people of African descent in this country. And my question to you is, do you think that militarization of the police to control Africans in America is linked to the Africom foothold, trying to gain a foothold in Africa? I see these as like a pincer, and I'm wondering, do you share that view? Thank you.
Yes, I certainly share that view, and I want to see it. But I share that view, but I also want to see that the strength of the Black Lives Matter movement, the strength of the Black Liberation movement is something that we should not minimize. Because what has happened in the United States of America in seizing the political leadership in this country through the rebellion that went on this year is very important in changing the history of the United States of America. You see, the militarization of Africa and the militarization of the Black community they're both bound up with the National Defense Authorization Act. And you remember in 2001, it was only one Black representative, Barbara Lee, that voted against this. And that the billions of dollars equipment from the military that is passed on to the police force is something which the Black Liberation Forces have been talking about defunding the police, and that the militarization of the police is not good for this society. So one has to intensify the work which has come out of this rebellion, and to ensure that this new administration do not carry forward discussions about integration and diversity and inclusion. Because I spoke about in the presentation about the difference between General William Ward and General Petraeus. Among the Black military leadership at the present moment, there's a lot of disquiet because their promotion, their ability to get access to the Pentagon's largest is all rooted in the racism. Now, the point is that a lot of the Black middle class that are in the fraternities and sororities and in the boulets, for them, the problem of fighting racism is for Blacks to get more access to being in the leadership positions. And I think this is where I think the point that Lisa was making, that this should be an alliance of the working class against the capitalist class. This is the point that she was making, that we should not be buying into diversity so that we get more Black officers in the military, that we have more Black police chief, or we have more Black officers. Certainly on professional grounds, they need to be promoted, but we need to promote the fight in changing the structure of the society and come back to the whole question of reparative justice. A lot of people talk about Black Lives Matter, but they never interrogate points of the Black Lives Matter in relationship to questions like reparations and reparative justice. One of the things the Trump administration and the conservatives tried to do was to create divisions between Africans from the United States and Africans abroad. So in the reparations movement, they created something called ADOS, African Descendants of Slavery, so that there's a rift between those in the movement fighting for reparations, those who are from Africa and the Caribbean and the United States of America. So the left have to be mindful of the kind of work which is going on many fronts by the right wing to divide the people on the left fighting for peace and reconstruction.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that's actually it for the questions and comments. Unless anyone wants to chime in at this moment, I think that we'll start to wrap up. We have already talked a little bit about what the peace movement can do, but I'd love to end the webinar with you sort of expanding on that, the different things that we can do in the peace movement to oppose and dismantle Africom. Professor Campbell.
Thank you. And I really appreciated the discussion. I think that one of the things that we should not do is we should not buy into the information warfare, the propaganda against Africans, and the divisions that are being promoted between Africans in the United States of America and Africans of the continent of Africa. The Trump administration has gone down that road so that someone like Cornel West is now appearing on the platform of ADOS. So that we have to bear in mind that solidarity among the forces of peace, the solidarity among the forces of social justice require that we place the anti-racist struggles at the center of our work.
I'm trying to answer.
In our discussions,
well, I have some media on apparently.
Mary, can you please mute yourself?
Yes, in the work that has been done on reparative justice and the work around Durban, the question of reparations for enslavement and that slavery constitutes a crime against humanity. We have to be mindful that the Obama administration, Condoleezza Rice, Obama, Susan Rice, Colin Powell agreed with the Israeli government to ensure that the Durban platform does not come before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. So the question of reparative justice and dealing with systemic racism means that people of African descent in the United States of America cannot be silent on oppression of other peoples, whether it's the Dalit peoples in India or the Palestinian peoples. And this is something that is very delicate in the politics of the United States of America. And so I would want to underline the fact that the Democratic Party in the United States of America have bought into the idea that Israel is the #1 democratic country in the West Asia, and that we should join with those citizens of Israel that oppose the oppression of the Palestinian people. I would also want to add that opposing United States Africa Command is also opposing APAC. Thank you, Kim. Opposing the United States Africa Command is also mean opposing United States sanctions against the people of Cuba and the people of Venezuela, because in the case of Cuba and Venezuela, we can see how the conservatism of the racist forces from Cuba and Venezuela impacts the politics of the United States of America. So our work is cut out for us. And I would say that your work in the National Lawyers Guild is being accentuated, because I know that in schools and universities, community colleges all over this country, there's room for you to change the curriculum of the law schools. This year, Princeton University took down the name of Woodrow Wilson from Princeton University because he was a racist. But Princeton University is not taking down the curriculum of racism, which is embedded in advanced education in this country. So all of the universities must now be open to the struggles of anti-racism in this country. So what I'm saying is that the struggles against Africom is not a compartmentalized struggle of dealing with the United States military destruction. It's part of a broader struggle against imperialism and global capitalism.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you for attending this webinar. Many, many thanks to Professor Campbell. The webinar is being recorded and you'll be able to access it on the NLG International website or Facebook page. And, just be in touch with us if you have any other questions or comments. All right, enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.
Cool, welcome back everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for the screening of that great lecture. And also for sticking around to the Q&A. I see there's 24 people watching, so we're gonna have a good discussion. Also, there you go. Hi, Monica. I see you have the Forward Ever Shop swag. I see. That's great. Hi, David. Welcome.
I got it. And my son got it too. We representing.
If you would like Monica and Avery's really dope sweatshirt, then you can search for Forward Ever Shop on Etsy and get your own. Everybody's wearing it. It's the cool kids. But that was a 90-minute lecture that was packed full of information. There was even European socialists acting a fool, geopolitical connections made, all kinds of things were going on in that lecture. It was quite rich. So why don't we start by talking about our thoughts and reflections upon watching it.
Thank you so much, Onyesawu. So excited to be here with you, as well as David and everyone else in the chat sharing about some of the presentations they've been able to hear other Africans talk about. And so for me, what I really appreciated about was the more context about Africom, and really thinking about kind of toward the end of what Dr. Campbell shared about not buying into the propaganda in Africa, what they're sharing in Africa, because why would we listen to our enemies? Our enemies are only going to be doing things to elevate their own, what they're trying to do, right? So like they're intentionally working to steal like land, resources, and control the labor in Africa. And so I appreciate Dr. Campbell talking about like offering a solution, about us being in solidarity together, and how centering systemic racism. And I think what's important about centering systemic racism is its direct connections to imperialism and capitalism, and how that impacts us here in the belly of the beast, and how it impacts Africa, and how it impacts Cuba and Venezuela. So I really appreciate like the connections that were being made, and also the context that Dr. Campbell provided more about Africom.
Yeah, I was, as you mentioned earlier, wellspring of information concerning the exercises and the number of nations that Africom has bases in, and also the I guess the difficulties in connection with the African Union and other nations, and maintaining solidarity in the African continent in opposition to U.S. or foreign interest, particularly in this regard, military interest. But it was a very thoughtful conversation, I thought, that the professor brought to us today.
Agreed. I really appreciate it when people connect, as Monica just did, and as Horace Campbell did throughout the talk, the systems of capitalism and imperialism to white supremacy as a tactic of those systems. Because I do feel like in the United States, there's a tendency to like think of white supremacy as its like own thing, completely separated from U.S. policy towards Africa, or U.S. policy towards Haiti, or even domestic U.S. policy towards us. So like having that understanding that Western imperialism is a global white supremacist project, that the intent of that project is to colonize Africa, to steal African resources, to maintain U.S. Global dominance on the backs of African people. So I really appreciate folks making it plain. Another person who does that really well is Ajama Baraka of the Black Alliance for Peace. He talks about like pan-European white nationalists. I'm just like, yes, like this is how we need to talk about this, because they are coordinating on a global basis, and the fundamental reason why they're doing it has never changed since slavery. It's all about exploitation and profit. But David, you came up with a list of like really great questions, and I want to know if you want to like ask some of them so we can talk about it.
Yeah, I don't know if there was a particular question that I should put forth, but I guess one of the things that came up for me, and actually one of the things he talked about, was about the everything that the U.S. was trying to offer as kind of an exchange. And so I guess I want to ask this question of what's the problem with the U.S. investing in African human rights, democracy, development, education, or health. I know some of the people that were in that conference kind of spoke to that, but I'm curious what you guys' perspective is on what the consequences are of accepting in U.S. investments in those endeavors and enterprises. What's connected with that?
Do you want to try to answer, Monica?
Well, if the U.S. empire is investing in something, it is only for the continued expansion of capitalism and imperialism. And so can't trust them as far at all. You know, they say can't trust you as far as I could throw you. And so when I hear the words like humanitarian and aid and support. Like, they don't even do that in this country. So why could we ever believe they would do that in another country? And so I feel it's, but because we've been like conditioned, sometimes there's this like false beliefhood of, oh yes, this is going to happen. But there's no time in history where this country has ever done anything that benefits anyone but white supremacy. And so I think what they talked about, the Bush administration, I think Dr. Campbell talked about the Bush administration. I forgot what they were offering like more partnership to support foreign trade. And none of that happened at all. Like this partnership is two people making an agreement about, and partnership, both parties benefit, right? And never has Africa benefited from any European country at all. It's continued like massive destruction and deep generational things that have impacted Africa, as well as like any African person wherever they are. So investment is always about centering the US empire's global economy and nothing else.
And the other thing is that whenever they talk about humanitarian intervention, like thousands go on to die. Lives are ruined, countries are destroyed. Like that's what happened in Libya, which you talked about at length. The whole reason why the US and NATO said they were going to invade and overthrow Gaddafi was because Gaddafi was supposedly a dictator. And now if you look at Libya today, it's a failed state. It has no functioning government. There are open air slave markets. There's terrorists, not terrorists, but like, far right-wing forces that were armed and funded by the United States just running stuff in Libya and like creating a continental-wide problem. So like every time you hear them say humanitarian intervention, a bunch of bodies are going to follow. Like that's just what the history shows. And then the other thing, we showed that there was like a 10-minute clip before the talk that was a short film produced by the Resist Africom Coalition. And in that video, they're literally, there's like PR footage from the U.S. military showing them like feeding African children, juxtaposed with like news reports about like drone bombings and stuff. Because that's what it looks like. They'll like, they'll hand us crumbs. They'll give like food while like, sanctioning a country to starve the people. They'll feed the children at the same time, like drone bomb schools and weddings. So like it's never really about, so-called humanitarianism. All it's about is like PR, public relations. They're trying to sell what they're doing as benevolent with these like so-called charitable acts, but you have to look at the larger policy to understand why it's really happening.
Agreed. I'll answer that question as well. It's something of a smoke screen, and there's that whole carrot and the stick thing. But the reality is there really is no carrot, and it's also kind of like that old adage they say about the window replacement guy, I guess, that goes around town breaking all the windows and then comes out and tells everybody, hey, I'm selling windows. They're marked up. I'm the only game in town.
That's real. Appreciate that analogy.
Yeah, this one gets could get a little more personal, but it doesn't have to be. This question is, what psychological or informational warfare have you witnessed at home and abroad?
I was just thinking about, go ahead, Monica.
Go ahead,
So I was just reading this morning about different like shows and movies in the U.S. media that have like demonized Venezuela, and you would think it would be like the like dude with the gun films, but it was like things like Parks and Recreation. There's that show on Amazon with the guy from The Office, Jim from The Office, is now a CIA collaborator, and so he has a show where he plays Jack Ryan and they demonize Venezuela. There was like another one, SNL. Like the propaganda against nations that are being targeted by imperialism is pervasive in the U.S. media. It's to the point where I don't think people even notice it's happening. Like I certainly did not notice it was happening until it became more anti-imperialist. But like we're like inundated with like straight up lies about places like Venezuela, places like Cuba, places like Libya, certainly like about the entire African continent, like in all forms of US media, from like the Grammys to like Amazon shows to like Marvel movies. Like there's just this clear imperialist lie, like this warmongering lie. And you would think, people think that that has no impact on them when they watch it. But if you don't know what's happening, if you don't have that consciousness, you're absolutely going to internalize it. And I feel like it's a big part of the reason why, like certainly not the only reason, but a big part of the reason why people in the United States don't really bat an eye when the US does like the empire stuff around the world. Like they invade a country and they're like, they had it coming. They talk about going to war with China and they're like, yeah, because like I feel like they've been like conditioned by this, like it is like psychological warfare, like propaganda, to believe that the US has the right to do these things.
Thank you, Onyesabu. I really appreciate you sharing about conditioning. Like I remember very clearly being like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, like no cable, watching, you know, the 4 channels we had, and there was repeatedly commercials about Africa, and it would show children who had no access to food, no access to water. It showed like tremendous environmental injustice. And I remember in elementary school not standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. It was very clear that that did not include me. And but I never identified as African until like a few years ago. But I knew I was an African American, like at all. Like, don't call me that. I know I'm not American at all. But I disconnected from that identity as African because I was like, well, I'm not born in Africa. I can't identify as African. And like, I had to have that conversation as a child with myself, and I identified as Black. And so I just remember, like, when I reflect on it now as an adult, I was separating myself from my people in Africa. And that's intentional, right? Because I don't want to be like them, struggling, having those challenges. And I'm so grateful that I unlearned that very quickly. And also like understand like my identity of self more and more. The other thing I think about is the conditioning of this country is rich because it's a God-serving nation. Like, you know, growing up in the church, just being indoctrinated in that, and just learning more and more and more. I would say really the past 2 years, learning about all of the stolen resources and the continued intentional destruction of Africa. And so that conditioning is real. And I'm so glad I'm able to have conversations with my son about things, because everywhere we go, like there is a US empire flag. There are things that are happening in his school. I mean, even when he's watching TV. And I'm so excited that I get to have these conversations with him. And I just know I felt lost growing up. And also like hated the color of my skin. Like it took me till I was 18 to love the skin I was in. And that was like society teaching me that not to love myself, right? And so I think that's like some of the psychological warfare it's had on me. And thank goodness I'm part of AAPRP to continue like growing and learning more about decolonizing my mind, as well as like being involved in the revolution and sharing that information with others as well.
Decolonizing the mind is real, and man, do they get us young. I remember having a heart-to-heart with my father. We were going on a trip to Chicago when I was a child, and I confessed to him that I felt inferior being of African descent. And I don't know that we've ever had that conversation since, but it ended in silence at the moment. And I guess it just shows how palpable and how traumatic it can be, even just to talk about the thing itself.
but also I remember I had my own, this is really connected to the military. I remember when I was in high school, I was in world history class of all things when 9/11 went down. And I remember standing up in the class and saying, I don't know where I got this from, but I was saying something about, like, I was talking about the US military interventionism overseas, and explaining that as the reason why this is happening. And I was quickly made to feel by a fellow student that essentially I wasn't American, or at least that's the way I took it in that moment, which is an interesting conversation of itself. But it's just interesting how there's this connection with, you're supposed to be patriotic, or you're supposed to be loyal to an apparatus or system that is designed for your complete destruction. It's just, I mean, that's a mind, you know what. But I'll go on to the next question listed here, unless someone else wants to ask one of those questions. And that was, how would you describe the objectives and strategies of the US militarization of Africa? Again, the question was, how would you describe the objectives and strategies of the US militarization of Africa? And I guess I'll answer first. One of the things that came up, oh, it looks like Impilo asked this question on YouTube. What position did Dr. Campbell take on Zim?
Sorry about that. I wasn't trying to stop your train of thought,
Oh,
David.
no, this is great. I prefer questions from folks. Okay, I'm not sure what Zim is short for.
I think it's for Zimbabwe. I think it's for Zimbabwe.
Okay,
Yeah, so
okay.
Dr. Horace Campbell had, at the time when Zimbabwe was being sanctioned by the United States and the United Nations and the UK, Dr. Horace Campbell took a position against ZANU-PF, and a position that was highly critical of Zimbabwe's land reform program. And as we discussed previously on the film series, when we showed that Mugabe documentary, the situation with the land reform program was seriously misrepresented in the West. And so I commented in the chat, Dr. Horace Campbell has a lot of insights when it comes to Africom, and many things that we can learn from him, but disagree with that position on Zimbabwe, particularly when they're being sanctioned. I don't think that was the time. But, we don't have to agree 100% with someone's positions on things to be able to learn from them. But yeah, that's what we were talking about.
Yeah, and if anyone else has questions, I definitely want to prioritize questions from folks that are listening in. The question I was asking before was, how would you describe the objectives and strategies of the US militarization of Africa? And one of the things that Dr. Campbell had mentioned, which I definitely affirm, is just control of African resources is a big part of that. And agency, which I hadn't noticed when I first looked at the presentation, but this time around, that came up near the end, and I realized, man, how powerful that is, and kind of simple, really. But it just shows how this militarism knows no bounds. It wasn't enough that we and our ancestors were stolen. Now they're going to come back to Africa, and not that they ever left, but additionally engage in further exploitation and control of resources. Did anyone else want to take that question? Or
I would just add is to what you're just saying is the continued destabilization of Africa. They want to have
control, definitely, for sure. I mean, if there's military bases in 53 of 54 countries, that shows what their intent is. They originally went to the Congress asking for, I forgot what the amount of money was for Africom, and they ended up getting 40 more billion. Africom's funded at almost $277 billion. And that's what we know. I meant $1 million. And that's what we know of, right? Because we always know there's always secret dark money that's around there. And so that shows right there where show the money, it shows where you're investing in. Their strategy is to train the military in Africa. Their strategy is to do continued destabilization, control. And I forgot my last thing I was gonna say, but it's showing it. The proof is in the pudding of exactly what they're trying to do. And also like having African people over like positions like US defense, I don't even know what their titles are, is like that, again, that representation. So it's like, oh, if an African person is leading it, it must be good, which is very similar to Obama, right? I'm learning about Africom, how it didn't expand like the way it did until Obama was in the presidency, right? And so all it is everything that you just shared.
Like what you said, you can see what the intent of Africom is by looking at the outcomes. Like all of these coups that are unfolding in nations that happen to be resisting imperialism or just happen to have a leader that's not cooperating the way the US and NATO want to, they always get them out of there. And the people who carry out the coups over and over and over again have gotten training from Africom and NATO. Like every single time, if you look at their background, there's training from Africom. Same thing with like the police and military forces, like Monica pointed out. We've talked many times about the End SARS protests that happened among the masses of youth in Nigeria last summer. The SARS unit is basically like Nigeria's answer to SWAT. It functions in a very similar way. It also targets the same people. And that was an entity created, trained, and funded by Africom. So like the entire point is to destabilize the continent, to like force violently repress African people who try to rise up against this. Actually, when he talks about the African soldiers that were, or not, the US soldiers that were killed in Niger and in Mali, I feel like that is a sign of what we're talking about, because the people living on the continent, for the most part, do not want this here. And so when that African US military soldier was stationed in Niger and the people found him, he was killed and his body was mutilated. They were like, what are you doing here? The thing he mentioned about Mali, I actually didn't know that African soldier was like brutalized by European racists living in Mali, reaping what they sow, I guess. But yeah, you just have to look at the results. You have to look at the coups. You have to look at the military dictatorships. You have to look at the police repression, and then you understand why they're there. It's solely to prevent a revolutionary force rising up in Africa and to ensure control of African resources.
Yeah, and we actually have more questions rolling in, so thank you guys. Keep it coming. This next one is from Emma. It says, is there any analysis on the transnational extractive industries in Africa and support for them from Africom?
Yes, look at the work of Black Agenda Report on Africom and look at the work of Black Alliance for Peace on Africom. The places where the U.S. military presence is intensifying, the places where they are placing their bases are strategic. They are located near water resources. They look at next to mineral and rare mineral resources. So like, read the articles on Black Agenda Report about Africom to understand that this is about resources. This is about land. Absolutely.
Another question was regarding that Dr. Campbell had talked in his work on collaboration between Africom and the terrorist groups to maintain their status quo presence. Can you expand on that and link his work? I think
I think that what they're referring to is the George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld kind of impetus for forming Africom and as a quote unquote response to the war on terror. If that's not correct, please correct this information.
I think what you just shared, David, is a good response to that question. Is like what was the collaboration of Africom and those groups in order to maintain what already exists, and you shared that, and I think the other part of the question is there information to like his research that can be linked as well in the chat is possibly the question as well.
We can find those resources and link them for sure.
Sorry, Onyesabu, you cut out?
I said we don't have them now, but we can certainly find them and put them in the YouTube description after the stream.
Thank you. And then I think is there an opportunity or if does anyone know any information to elaborate on the continued on collaboration with like Africom and other groups, like European groups, like for example, what happened with Gaddafi? Is there anything that can be elaborated? He mentioned relation to Al-Shabaab and Africom. Oh, okay, that's what they were specifically asking for elaboration on. Is there more information that we have on connection of Al-Shabaab and Africom?
Yeah, I don't know that we can answer that off the top of our heads. I will say that the stated intent of the U.S. military's Africa Command is to fight the spread of terrorism in Africa. But if you look at terrorist activity on the continent, before Africom was a presence in Africa, before the last year of George Bush's term, it was not something that you saw transnationally in Africa. It was something that occurred in like a handful of African nations in extremely isolated conditions. After the presence of Africom, that's when you start to see terrorism becoming a continental-wide phenomenon, going across borders, spreading to countries where it had never been witnessed before in terms of like far-right extremists. And so that, to me, like if the stated intent of Africom is to fight terrorism, and terrorism is worse after they got there, what does that actually mean? Like, what is happening? It's not working. So I think that is a really important connection to investigate further, for sure.
One thing too, I would just add that is that it's kind of frightening, at least to me, the connections between militarism of police here in the United States and Black communities and U.S. militarism in Africa. And you might say that the war on terror or the quote unquote Black menace has been going on since we've been here as a means of justifying white supremacy. And also there's this kind of paternalism that's connected to that in Africa and here in the United States.
Yeah, he actually even says that at one point. He says that the whole justification for Africom being about fighting terrorism was never going to hold sway on the continent because the masses of African people on the continent had witnessed imperialist powers calling our freedom fighters terrorists for generations. Like that language had been used in anti-colonial struggles throughout the 20th century. And so they already had known, like, this is who you mean when you say terrorist. And so when the U.S. military was coming here to be like, we're helping you by fighting terrorism, the Africans were not buying it. But I do also think that thinking about the war on terror as not what it's described to be, but rather as part of a global like counterinsurgency effort, a way to extend the U.S. empire's like surveillance and military apparatus even further, a way to erode civil liberties, a way specifically to police and repress social justice movements, anti-colonial movements, and anti-imperialist movements, is the way that we need to be thinking about this. I do feel like we have to understand that it's not about security, it's not about safety, it's about repression, it's about counterinsurgency and counter-revolution. Like, this is what they're doing.
Onyesabu, given that what you just shared,
like the strategies that they're doing that are counter-revolutionary to divide us, what are things that we can do? And Dr. Campbell posed this and shared about this a little bit, but I thought it would be something good for us to discuss. How can we be mindful of what's happening and what they're doing to continue to divide our people, whether they're on the continent, whether they're here in the belly of the beast, in the empire, or other places? How do we be mindful of that, and how do we, and like, what are solutions that we can do to bring us together to like work on like the demands, for example, that Black Alliance for Peace has? Those are really great demands around Africom.
I feel like African people, particularly after Obama, but it really started with like Colin Powell and Bill Clinton. But like we kind of like checked out when it came to imperialism, when it came to like resisting imperialism. Like there wasn't any kind of organized mass resistance among African people in the United States when the US military expanded its footprint in Africa. And like we said on the show many times before, that's why they did it under Obama. Had they had tried to do that under Bush, it would not have worked out. People would have said something, but when it happened under the first African president, people were like, okay, maybe this is a good thing. I do feel like we have an internationalist tradition among revolutionary African politics in the United States that has been abandoned to an extent. Like certainly DAPRP carries it forward, Black Alliance for Peace carries it forward, there's groups carrying it forward, but it doesn't exist on a mass basis anymore. So we have to connect what's happening to us domestically to what's happening to Africans all over this planet. We have to understand that we live in a global empire, and the so-called line of demarcation between like domestic and foreign policy does not exist. Everything that the U.S. does abroad affects us within the United States. The same people arming police with surplus military weapons, literal bomb-sniffing robots, are also arming and funding training police in places like Colombia, in places like Mozambique, in places like Mali. So we have to understand that it's like one global struggle against the same enemy, using very similar tactics all over the world. We have to like reignite the tradition of internationalism that our people have always had, that the counter-revolution deliberately attacked. And so what that looks like, I certainly think, is like having like conversations like this about Africom, doing the work that Black Alliance for Peace is doing to like raise mass consciousness about what's going on, engaging in like mobilizations. Like when the United States is like, let's occupy Haiti, like we should be in the streets. When the United States is like, let's drone bomb Somalia, let's drone bomb Tanzania, we should be in the streets. We should be saying this is not okay with us. We have to understand that those are our relatives that they're doing this to, and it's the same people that are giving us hell too. So I do think, yeah, let's just reignite that internationalism. Let's like be self-critical and reflect upon why this happened and how we got here, and then let's get back to where we need to be.
That's beautiful. I don't have anything else to add.
Yeah, that's there's a couple things. I don't know if we are, but it kind of stirring me up a little bit today about this discourse. Esper Hans had a comment. They said, can you expand about Agra and the ownership of seeds? I myself couldn't speak too much to Agra, but in regards to the ownership of seeds, one thing I just wanted to add to the discussion was that this is just another way of controlling African resources. Or another way to look at it in this sense is to control African diets, for example, or the African economy. So these seeds may not be African. They may be created in a lab, who knows where, right? But they're going into African soil. They are copyrighted. They're controlled by companies like Monsanto, which Campbell mentioned in the video. And it's just another way to control the African people and also land. So even if they don't own, even if Africom doesn't necessarily own a plot of land,
of a farmer, if they own the seed, that's another form of invasion.
Yeah, piggybacking off what you shared, David. I don't know but about Monsanto, we know all over what they've done is like been able to steal land from farmers, saying that the seeds that they're growing, because of how they plant it and how they and how the seeds blow, and so been able to steal land from farmers, right? And we also know a lot of times with this purchasing of these seeds, the promise of crops and no crops at all, like tons and tons of water in places that are scarcity in water. And we also know it's not natural. And then, like, as an African people, we're spiritual too. Like, we have connection to the land, we have connection to the ground, the connection to the food that we grow and eat. And so when you're modifying these seeds, you're modifying our connection to the land, you're modifying our connection to food. And so I think that it's that also like can impact us spiritually and culturally as a people as well. And so and just adding on to what you're saying is, whoever controls the seeds controls the money, right? Whoever controls the seeds, capitalism continues to grow. When we know that as a people, we're a collective, we should be growing food and sharing food with each other, right? Not trying to monopolize it. And that's what happens with these companies like Monsanto and others.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat, there's an article on Hood Communist that covers this. There's an article on Hood Communist for everything. But it's called The Disadvantages of Neoliberal Agricultural Modernization in Africa, written by Comrade Kizabou Diallo, who's talking about that agri deal, talking about the privatization of land and seeds in Africa and the impact that's having on subsistence farmers. So I definitely recommend folks check that out for more information about what the doctor was talking about in the lecture. Also, I see there's another question. When Dr. Campbell says Ethiopia and Africa in general need to demilitarize, is he referring to American and African bases only, or does he mean African nations should not be armed? I can't say what the comrade meant. It did definitely come off a little bit like some both sidesism, which is unfortunate, but you know, I can say that like our position is that no, it's not a matter of like African nations demilitarizing, absolutely not. Like, nations need to be able to defend their sovereignty, particularly when there are U.S. military bases all over the continent. And so hopefully he meant that the American embassy and African bases need to demilitarize, but I cannot say.
On another point, I wanted to add that to part of the question, clarification that Africom bases are American bases. So that is Africom is a U.S., I guess you might say, military operation or agency. So there's really no distinction between America and Africom.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because you made me think about, and Dr. Campbell spoke about, and I know this is a previously recorded interview, but he talked about how now is the time, because the Africom main headquarters is in Germany, and they're wanting to move it somewhere else. And now is the time to really hone in on what's occurring, to really spread the word to masses. That way, like, that headquarters doesn't exist, and we're able to dismantle Africom. So I was wondering, do you all know an update regarding what's occurred since the interview?
I know the neocolonial leadership of Nigeria offered to have Africom headquartered there, and the people were like, what the hell? They've also talked about moving it, I believe, to the Southeast United States, but I'm not sure if that was like something that was seriously considered. But as of now, I have not heard that there's a confirmed new location. The primary concern is that if they move it to the African continent, even if the nation is led by a neocolonial leader, the people there are they're not gonna take it. Like, they're already, like, you know, attacking the U.S. military bases. They're already, like, engaging in acts of resistance on the continent. Like, Africa is, like, constantly ablaze with people rising up against injustice. And so it would be a very precarious thing if the United States would move the headquarters to Africa, and they know that. And it would be hopefully very similar if they tried to move it, you know, to somewhere in the United States. African people would fight it, I think. I hope we could organize them to do so. But yeah, that's what I heard last, that the leadership of Nigeria was like, hey, us. And then they were talking about somewhere in the southern United States.
A question that we had, and I wanted to tell folks that are listening, please feel free to respond to the questions in the chat as well as offer additional questions. But this is kind of connected to the question about the seeds, and that is, I should say metaphorically speaking, how does the reproduction of white supremacy strengthen U.S. militarism?
So I just want to reiterate that white supremacy is not like a thing on its own. White supremacy is a particular strategy of imperialism, of capitalism. Same thing with racism, systemic racism. Like, they are symptoms of a larger problem. But the way that U.S. imperialism reinforces white supremacy is that the entire, like, American mythology, the entire foundation of American nationalism is a belief in, like, European supremacy. It always has been. That's why when this empire was founded, the only people considered actual citizens were European men. That's why for hundreds, like over 100 years, everybody else was not allowed to vote or participate in society. So we have to understand that acts of European imperialism, acts of American imperialism are carrying forward that same foundational ideology that is based in European supremacy, that is based in a fundamental belief that the entire rest of the world is a plantation for them to exploit. That everybody else on this planet can be subjected to all kinds of, like, violence and brutality and barbarism simply because Europeans are superior and Europeans have the civilization that everybody else has to aspire to and be a part of, even by force. So, like, that's how we have to understand U.S. imperialist projects. And even if you look at how the news talks about the nations that are being targeted by imperialism, you can see it. Like, right now, we are currently living through some kind of new Red Scare targeting China. There's all kinds of, like, metaphors about dragons being thrown around, all kinds of, like, extremely racialized language describing this nation as somehow an existential threat to the United States, when China's like, can you leave us alone? Can you stop colonizing these places? Can you let us live? Same thing happened during the initial stages of the so-called war on terror, when the targets were in the Middle East, were in places like Afghanistan and places like Iraq. We saw them being called, like, sand N-words. We saw a demonization of Islam on a mainstream basis that still exists to this day. We saw extremely racialized language being used to describe this culture that was positioned as inferior to white European culture. So this is like a repeating theme. Same thing happened in Libya and the way they demonized Gaddafi. Same thing in the way that they talk about Cuba and Venezuela. It's extremely racialized. It always has been. It's this idea that Western civilization is better, when Western civilization is, like, literally the most barbaric civilization on this planet. Like, the New York Times in particular, with the dragon metaphors when it comes to China, is, like, out of control. I don't know if y'all have noticed that, but they're all, like, every time the U.S. media, like Time, New York Times, CNN, they talk about China, they're talking about dragons. They're talking about dragons. I'm like, what are you talking about? It's like this extremely Orientalist, weird projection about this culture that is seen as the antithesis to, like, Western imperialist culture.
And like Dr. Campbell said, you know, it reads like something that was cooked up in a think tank. All this stuff is very much generated and informed by intellectuals who are aligned with American imperialism. And we have a comment here in the chats to that effect from Emma. Africom has military bases, which is very visible says that Campbell also talks about Africom infiltrating academic spheres to influence the literature coming out of there. And that is also an important place of fight. Also connected to that, a mythology of bringing peace to Africa through Africom as a form of white supremacy and the civilizing mission of colonizers to Africa.
I mean, they're controlling. Sorry, David, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, they're controlling the media. So I want to share that on social media, I have seen more information coming from the US empire about Africom than I have seen about what's really happening. And that's intentional, right? If I wasn't part of AAPRP, I probably would not know, right? And being able to get information from the Black Agenda, the Black Alliance for Peace, AAPRP, people like Dr. Campbell, like being able to share that information, me learn about it, also sharing it. And still I've seen more pieces like, you know, those news reports come, this is what Africom is, this is what Africom is doing. And that's why I knew about it when we first talked about it. Like I knew about it, but I didn't know the truth about it, right? I was like, oh, I've heard of Africom. Oh, but I didn't, not the real Africom, right? So, and it speaks to what Emma said, like people keep falling for it, and people are falling for it because of the frame that the US empire does. Like they're framing, they're always there to support people. They're always there to do this. Africa can't govern themselves, so we got to govern them, right? And people keep falling for it. So our messages have to be even louder. And so I appreciate like all the readings that Hood Communist is putting out, and how we're able to create our own media and share what's really happening. I think that's so important and so critical because they're controlling the message. And the more we're able to share, well, not just share, but offer, like share information and say, okay, if they were kind of like what Dr. Campbell did, if their role was to stabilize Africa, why is there more terrorism in Africa, right? Like being able to counter everything Africom says they're about, because this, like, people are so unconscious about what's happening on the continent. And then being able to say, and here are solutions. And let me tell you why these are critical solutions. So I think that's important too.
And Sally Fu pointed out in the YouTube comments that, so some folks have an awareness that Africom is there, but like the majority of Americans like have no idea. Like when those U.S. military soldiers were killed in Niger by the people because they were like, get out. People were like, wait, what? There were troops in Niger? And then like a couple of weeks ago, they sent 2,000 soldiers to the Horn. And that was like barely, it was like one paragraph in the newspaper. So I do think that there isn't, there's either like acceptance among the people who know about it because of that like white supremacist, the internalization of that white supremacist lie that this is a civilizing mission. But then for like most folks, they're just like, there are troops in Africa? Like they have no idea because it's not really discussed on the US media.
Yeah, and as Emma mentioned in the chat, public keeps falling for it. I have to admit that I have fallen for it before in the past. I remember speaking with a Afro-Cuban friend of mine in the urban ag work, and I had said something about, I'd asked him a question about a report, and I think you had made mention of this on your Sunwoo, about people protesting about, I guess about the Cuban government connected with COVID or the economy or something to that effect. And I asked him about that, and it wasn't necessarily that I had one perspective about it one way or another, but it was just the fact that by engaging in US mass media, it was informing what I was even talking about. So it was impacting the discussion in that way. and by virtue of me bringing that as a point of topic or conversation, there was kind of crickets in that conversation as well. But it just shows how important it is that the AAPRP is generating discourses like we're doing today, and we're having the political education so we can combat that, and also that we can decolonize our minds as well, as Monique had mentioned earlier.
It looks like we have one more question about reparative justice. When it comes to reparative justice, where do we begin or end? And I think this was a reference to, like, at the beginning of the talk, Professor Horace Campbell mentions that, like, reparations are due for the U.S. militarization of the continent, for, like, the imperialist exploitation of the continent. And so that was this question was referring to? When it comes to reparative justice, where do we begin or end?
Are you saying reparative justice?
Yep.
When it comes to...
Yeah, that was a reference to something Dr. Campbell had mentioned about that being something of value and importance on the African continent. And I think that for me, the biggest things that kind of stand out from the presentation and just from lived experiences, just that agency part. I mean, like, if African peoples had free reign to leverage their own agency without intervention from European or American agendas of one kind or another, I don't think there would be any need for, to the extent that there is any need for the carrot that's at the end of that stick that I mentioned earlier. That if African peoples, again, without intervention, foreign agendas were free to decide and create their own societies and so forth, that's the end of the conversation for me. But as far as I guess the more discrete items for injustices, I think definitely when it comes to African resources, that those need to be returned to African people.
I had never heard of reparative justice until Dr. Campbell brought it up. And so what I really liked about it and how it distinguishes restorative justice is we're not trying to heal relationships. We don't need all that. It's like return our land. That's what needs to happen. And I really feel like the demands that the Black Alliance for Peace has, like withdraw from Africa, demilitarization in the continent, closure of all bases throughout the whole entire world, like those kind of things are like repair, right? Because then once we're able to control our land, our resources, we're able to like build that one unified socialist Africa, right? Once we're able to, once the destruction of capitalism and imperialism ends, we're able to do that. I also think that we have to heal as a people because like the generational trauma that exists because of the conditions of white supremacy, imperialism and capitalism, like things aren't gonna be beautiful and painted in this portrait because we're all conditioned in white supremacy. And so I think like the healing that has to happen, like we're taught we're broken. We're not broken, we're whole, like, but it's in us and like returning to that.
and exist, like returning to our land, our traditions. So I think there's things that we have to do as a people collectively to decide like what repair looks like for us. And these other European empires that have continued to exploit, murder, profit, build a global economy, just give us our land back. We're good, right? And then maybe there needs to be other things that I'm not thinking about at the top of my head right now as well.
So I just want to go really back quickly to the question about, there was like a question asked about what is the connection of Africom to like transnational corporations that engage in extractivism in Africa. And I was thinking about the recent coup in Guinea that deposed a leader that the people, that was very unpopular, that the people have been trying to get out for quite some time. And so when the coup happened initially, people were like, maybe this is a positive thing because this leader was not for the people. And then when more was known about who carried out the coup, it turned out that it was like this military leader who had again been trained not just by NATO, by France specifically, and also by Israel. But then the other thing that it turned out was that the deposed president of Guinea had been resisting a deal with the French mineral company about ownership of a bauxite mine or like bauxite mining interests. And as soon as like the new military leadership came to power, they like, shut down the Constitution. They shut down the borders for people, but they allowed the borders to remain open for the export of minerals, and they made assurances publicly that they would continue with these deals and continue in the exports and continue in the mining. So they basically signaled like Guinea is open for business. And so that, I feel like that's, I wish I could remember the names off the top of my head, but I do not. But that's a situation that folks should read into more because you can clearly see the paper trail. Like the leader that was deposed was not progressive, but he was balking on signing this deal over these mineral rights. And then, coincidentally, Western imperialist power trained military commando who used to be this man's like bodyguard got him up out of there and then was like Guinea's open for business. And that's like the kind of connection that you can find when you look at, like when you investigate the background of these people carrying out the coups. And you investigate like the kind of like deals that the people who have been deposed were engaged in or refusing to engage in. So I just thought of that. But to the question of like reparations and like it not just being about like monetary repair, but also about like repair of our dignity as a people, I do think like one thing I really appreciated in this talk was when the Professor Horace Campbell was like, we have to be really careful as anti-imperialists in the West to not frame Africom as like dominating African people in Africa. Like the population of the continent is like billions of people. Africom's military footprint is like tens of thousands. And so we don't want to advance a narrative that like tens of thousands of like US troops and like mercenaries and military contractors are somehow dominating an entire continent full of people. We always have to uplift the truth that African people are rising up on a consistent basis all over the continent. Like this past week, there were African people's uprisings in Senegal, in Mozambique, in Azania. When the U.S. military talked about a new military agreement in Ghana, the people in Ghana took the streets and were like, hell no. So whenever imperialists make these incursions onto the continent, there is always resistance. Even the U.S. military soldiers being killed in Niger was resistance. So I feel like we have to be very careful to say that like African people are going to defeat Africa. African people are carrying out militant organized resistance. And our role as Africans in the diaspora is to like uplift that resistance, is to resist the empire, to say that we are not okay with this and we're going to fight you, we're going to tie you up here so you can't do anything over there. But also be careful to like center the dignity and the agency of the Africans, of our people. But then yeah, reparations to me is not possible. Like with the scale of what is owed is like not possible to pay within the current framework of capitalism. It would like bankrupt these nations. It would bankrupt the United States. It would bankrupt all of Europe. It would bankrupt Israel. Like it's a lot of money that's owed. It would bankrupt like most of the corporations in existence on this planet. So yeah, like reparations is a funny conversation for me because it's just not going to happen without a revolution. They're not going to bankrupt themselves. So yeah.
And you have to think it would bankrupt them in the future, right?
I mean, it's that on that much of a scale. We're not even talking about present. This has been going on for so long, and so many lives and futures, past histories have been impacted. Like this is, we're talking about a debt that can't be paid for centuries.
Yeah, every time they bring it up in Congress, which doesn't make sense to me, because they're never going to pass it. Bring up like they're always a, what's it called? A Democratic politician brings up reparations. Like, one, you're not going to do it, but it's just like the pandering, right? The pandering that happens, or the representation that happens every time that comes up. So like, and I think, you know, that was also, Dr. Campbell like spoke about that in regards to like the ADOS movement, right? As well, and like what that looks like, but how we can come together to see like how we can define like what we need as a people, what we, and like, you know, the APRP talks about one unified socialist Africa. And so the reparations would just be a handout. It would not be for the liberation of our people.
I also think they are going to do it, to be honest with you. I think that they will. That's why they keep talking about it. That's why they keep making these like overtures, like giving us seats. Like they're going to give like some poison crumbs to convince us that we have like a place here. So like when I think reparations will come, and it's going to look like what happened when they paid reparations for Japanese internment, or when they attempted to pay reparations for the Holocaust. What happened was that there was like this upper strata of like petty bourgeois people, of like NGOs that got all of the money, and then like the regular people got like nothing. Like I think we showed a Norman Finkelstein interview where he talks about whose mother, who survived the Holocaust, got like $5,000, and meanwhile there were all these like, you know, right-wing Jewish organizations that got like millions of dollars. So that, I think that's what's going to happen. They're going to be like grants for small business owners, or like some way, like some handout to like the middle class, like the African petty bourgeois, to like placate them, and then like make to use them to repress us. And so that's why it's really important to have an understanding of reparations. Is not just like checks being handed out to individual people, but actually like as repair. Like what does like repair from the entities exploiting Africa look like? And like in the APIP's reparation platform, we talk about how these African nations owe entities like the IMF trillions of dollars in extremely exploitative loans. Meanwhile, the entire GDP of all of these imperialist countries, or like the majority of the GDP of these imperialist countries, is based on a foundation of looted resources from Africa. Like they're stealing from us, and then like giving us like usurious loans, and then being like, we expect you to pay that back. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like wild. So like certainly like loan forgiveness for this really shitty foreign aid, like this trap of foreign aid, should absolutely be a part of a conversation. The dissolution of these corporations that were like founded with slavery money and keeping going with like stolen African resources should be part of the conversation. Like at this point, companies like Apple, Dell, Tesla, that are like fighting for resources, stolen African resources, should belong to African people. Like the only reason you're making your devices is because of resources that were stolen from Africans. So let's talk about what giving like the nations that you stole from a part of your profits looks like. I think that we have to like think on like a much larger scale in terms of what is owed, and we have to think about what is going to develop us as a collective, because individual checks to individual people, no matter how big those checks are not going to advance us as a collective, as an African nation. So how do we develop the continent with reparations? How do we develop as a collective, as a people of reparations? And how do we understand the scope of it so we actually get what's owed when this revolution kicks off?
The other part of that equation is, and I'm seeing in the chat a little more conversation about agra and seeds and land agency, is in the reparations conversation is also the seeding of resources, and I mean CEDE, the releasing of resources and powers by those who have acquired them in ill-gotten ways, or unjust ways. And one of the things that Emma brings up is that she wants to bankrupt all those people. So that definitely seems like a good next step. Also, Danny mentioned, and this is in connection with the Bill Gates Foundation, which apparently owns large swaths of land in Africa, that charity will not solve Africa's problems, only self-determination. And also he mentions, or they mention Africa being organized under scientific socialism, which I wouldn't be able to speak to myself, the scientific socialism part, but in regards to self-determination, in regards to, you know, what you mentioned earlier, Onya Sanwu, about the reparations, like it is going to be tantamount to charity or breadcrumbs, if you will. It's not restorative, it's not restitution of loss. And it's just going to be, hey, we gave you this. Don't say we didn't ever give you anything.
Thank you so much. And I accidentally said handout and I meant to say crumbs. So thank you, Onyesawu. And I really like the way you brought in my even understanding of, like, there are companies making millions and millions of dollars, and what does repair look like for them? So I really appreciate, like, you sharing that context, because there's so many of them. There's so many banks, like even Firestone tires, like there's so many of them that have just profited. And so I appreciate you sharing that addition.
Yes, and ultimately reparations are a completely theoretical conversation until we have a global mass movement of African people that is powerful enough and militant enough and organized enough to demand them and to win them. I do think that, like I said, we have a responsibility to, like, reconstitute the history of internationalism among African people in the United States. We have to begin to understand our liberation struggle is happening on, like, a global scale, with Africa being the heart of it, and make the connections between domestic police repression and international militarism. So, like, I've been thinking about, like, what that looks like and what that means, and, like, certainly, like, Black Alliance for Peace's work is a really important model, and, like, the historical work of the APRP is a really important model. I also think about the struggle against, it wasn't against apartheid, it was against colonialism in Azania, and how there was on the ground in Azania a national liberation movement that was engaged in an armed struggle, and then on the ground in the United States, there were Africans, like, shutting down commerce, engaging in boycotts, engaging in, like, mass mobilizations, who were in communication with those forces on the ground in Azania. Like, the APRP was on the front lines of that in the 80s and 90s, and we're bringing, like, Pan-African Congress of Azania people, Azapo people here to speak, and, like, yeah, organizing boycotts of their industries and all kinds of things. And so it shows, like, apartheid fell. The land is still controlled by the settlers in Azania, but apartheid did fall. That they forced them to negotiate in that national liberation struggle. So it shows that that kind of, like, coordinated action could be successful. It shows that we can do it. Same thing happened, honestly, with the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese fought the armed struggle on the ground. They fought their national liberation struggle on that front, but there was also an extremely robust anti-imperialist movement here in the United States that extended into the U.S. military. There were people enlisted in the U.S. military in Vietnam that, like, blew up their commanding officers and were like, we're not going to fight. We don't want to be here. So, like, we have to rebuild that in the United States. We have to stop engaging. Like, we're always, like, sharing our whack-ass criticisms of nations fighting imperialism. We're always talking about what they should be doing while not really doing anything here. We're not doing enough here. We're not playing our part. We're not playing our position. So, like, I just wonder, like, how do we reconstitute such a movement? How do we build such a movement to resist Africom in the United States? Because right now there's, like, a widespread fatalism. There's, like, this belief that we have no impact whatsoever on U.S. foreign policy, so there's no point in even trying. But if you look at the history, it's just not true.
Do you guys think it helps if there's no black faces in Africom? Do you think that that makes a difference, or if it does, to what extent? What does it matter, for example, that there are a number of Black soldiers or generals that are engaged in the work of Africom, and what are our connections in our communities between with servicemen and women in African American communities serving in those armed forces, and maybe what there is to be done in regards to those connections, because some of these individuals are members of our families, they're part of our communities, so maybe there's an opportunity there. I don't know. What are you guys' thoughts?
To clarify, was your question is if there weren't African people in leadership positions or in Africom, would that make a difference in explaining the negative impacts of Africom? Was that to clarify, was that your question?
I guess this is kind of related to something Campbell had mentioned in connection with Lisa about Black people ascending to higher ranks and professions or what have you. And I guess my question is trying to get, Campbell had seemed to suggest that as a matter of professionalism, that Black people should be promoted in the ranks in the military. But I think that that's a minor point or conversation in the context of, I guess a metaphor I use sometimes is like being proud of having the first Black executioner. It just brings a question to mind for myself, and I guess I wonder. It's kind of feels like a form of co-signing, you might say, and I guess I wonder what to what extent it matters that there are African Americans participating in Africom on the African continent, and what, if anything, we can do about that.
So I want to answer the latter part of your question first and then circle back to your original question. I think what I heard Dr. Campbell say was even Africans in the US military are impacted by systemic racism. I believe he said 41% are European and the rest are colonized folks. And within that, only 4% are in leadership positions. I think he was making a point to say, look, within their own governmental structure, look at this data and how much racism, systemic racism exists in that. So I think he did that to elevate a point about the falsehood of representation and the systematic racism that's also occurring in the US military. I think that there are a lot of people who are just really out of touch. I was one of those, like not understanding the bigger context about there's a lot of people who focus on reform rather than like liberation, right? And so I think somebody made a comment about there are a lot of people who don't even know about Africom. So I think there's just like a lot of disconnection. I think that people are indoctrinated with so much information that the discussions about Africom are more critical in solutions, regardless if our people are in Africom or not. I think like your theoretical question is hard for me because they're gonna make sure African people are in Africom, especially on the continent, right? They are training Africans on the continent to be part of Africom, right? To uplift white supremacy, to uplift imperialism. So I think your theoretical question is a little harder for me to imagine. And I think it's so important and so critical for people to understand why being African and in the US
military is what is it called? To understand like what they've signed up for and the harm that they're creating that's connected to imperialism. So I think it's really important for people to understand what that means and what that looks like.
I feel like it's an old phenomenon in terms of like African people being enlisted in imperialist conquest of Africa. Like I think about when like the initial scramble for Africa happened at the Berlin conference, and all of these European powers engaged in settler colonial projects and like a scramble for resources on the continent. A lot of times they would have entire units of the occupying army that were African people that had been hired to engage in that work. And that was happening like 200 years ago. So I really feel like it's the same thing. I feel like every time I talk about Africans, the military offends somebody. But to be honest with you, I feel like it's the same thing. It's the same thing as like the Buffalo Soldiers. It's the same thing as like the African colonial shock troops. It's the same thing as European powers during World War I and World War II, fighting entire fronts of that conflict that had nothing to do with us in Africa with African soldiers. They've been doing this for a long time. Same thing, and it's not just African people that it happens to. There's like a remarkable amount of Central and South Americans and Mexican folks in the U.S. Border Patrol, for example, in ICE. So like it's like a deliberate strategy where they cultivate a particular kind of like counterinsurgency force by like targeting the colonized people themselves and like recruiting us for it. So I think that we have to look at it like objectively to say that like you are being enlisted in a project that is meant to annihilate your people, that is meant to colonize your land. There's all these narratives about like economic opportunity or like military service being a way for African people to advance, or like being a police officer being a way for African people to advance. And also lots of narratives about us being represented within structures of empire being somehow like a victory for all of us. And I feel like the way to combat that is not necessarily to demonize the people in those positions, although some of them deserve it, but instead to raise the consciousness among our people so that we have an understanding on a collective basis that that kind of representation is not positive for us. Representation in positions of power within an empire that has genocidal intentions toward African people is not a win for us. It's not positive. Like, that's the consciousness that's lacking. Like, when Kamala Harris ran for vice president, when Lloyd Austin was nominated for Secretary of State, an African man, used to be on the board of Raytheon, as a matter of fact, used to be in the leadership of Africom, now he's Secretary of State. When those people are, like, put forward, there's still the mainstream line coming from us that this is positive for us, because there isn't that consciousness that we can't actually change this from the inside. It doesn't matter who's the figurehead if the foundation of it is about exploiting Africa and exploiting African people. So rather than focusing on the individuals, I think that we need to focus on creating that consciousness. And then the rest, that will follow. People will begin to reject the Kamala Harris, will begin to reject the Lloyd Austins, will begin to reject the Colin Powells, and instead uplift our real heroes. So I think we said this would be 2 to 5, so this would be a good time to close it. Do either of you have any final thoughts as we wrap it up?
No, just want to say appreciate the discussion that's happened in the chat, appreciate the discussion here, and more information about Africom as well as solutions. And so, and then also some readings that were posted. So I look forward to go checking those out to learning more. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, thanks for allowing me to be part of the discussion today. And I really enjoyed this talk.
Thanks, y'all. That has been the Pan-African Film Series. We do these on the second Saturday of each month, which means we'll be back in January with another film. Don't ask me what it is, because I don't know. But we will be back second Saturday in January. And please join us in 2 weeks for the next edition of Weekly Pan-African News. And please stay tuned for some It's actually a photo slideshow of AFRP organizing from all over the world, plus some jams, so enjoy that.
Every day, from the moment I wake, there are thoughts that stay on my mind. Is there really a way to keep faith in our hearts when it seems that our lives are falling apart? Dreams from the night follow me when I rise, and my fears bring tears to my eyes. Will our hopes be realized? Will our children survive? Will they see freedom in their lifetime? Will I believe in the power of faith, in the